Good afternoon. On behalf of the faculty and trustees of the George Washington University, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Jack Morton Auditorium for this important discussion sponsored by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. This afternoon, we're privileged to have four distinguished panelists with us who will share their views on the role of the humanities in the United States. I am honored to welcome Associate Supreme Court Justice David Souter, Mellon Foundation President Don Michael Randle, Patricia Stonepfeiffer, who is Senior Advisor to the Gates Foundation and Chair of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution, and President Edward Ayers of the University of Richmond. My name is Steve Knapp, by the way, President of the University, and we at GW take great pride in our long-standing association with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which has long been dedicated to the promotion of scholarship and the advancement of learning, in fact, dedicated to those missions for some 230 years. With us today are 9 members of our faculty who have been elected to national academies, and I'd like to take just a moment to acknowledge them. They are Allison Spence Brooks, James Horton, and Stephen Joel Trachtenberg, who are members of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and Jordan Cohen, Peter Hotez, Amitai Etzioni, Vanessa Northington Gamble, Frederick Goodwin, and Fitzhugh Mullen, who are members of the Institute of Medicine. And it is now my great privilege to introduce Leslie Berlowitz, the Chief Executive Officer and William T. Golden Chair of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Leslie Berlowitz.
Thank you, President Knapp. We are so pleased to be here at George Washington University, and we are grateful for your long-standing support of the humanities. As many of you know, Steve is the 16th president of George Washington University and a scholar of 18th and 19th century English literature. Perhaps fewer of you know that, like the namesake of this university, he is a gentleman farmer. In fact, fleece from the Knapp family farm, which includes breeds from George Washington's estate, has taken top honors at the Maryland State Fair. Steve, we are very grateful to you and to GW for welcoming us this evening and for your stewardship of research and the humanities. Now, in the tradition of the Academy, and on behalf of its officers, it is my privilege to call to order the 1940th stated meeting of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The topic of our conversation tonight is the public good, the humanities in a civil society. Since its founding in 1780, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences has been deeply concerned with both the humanities and a civil society. We played a major role in creating the American Council of Learned Societies, the Independent Research Libraries Association, the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities. The Academy also oversaw the creation of the National Humanities Center. And a decade ago, we launched our ongoing initiative for the welfare of humanities and culture, including a quest for data. The initiative has 3 goals. The first is to sponsor original scholarship, such as the most recent issues of our journal Daedalus, which has examined the disciplines of the humanities. The second goal is to improve the collection of data about the humanities. The recently released Humanities Indicators is a prototype for this work. Modeled after the National Science Board's Science and Engineering Indicators, it is the first comprehensive set of statistical information about the humanities in the United States. We have included with the program an extract of these indicators, or you can find them online. There you can play with and explore the indicators more fully and find the data behind the data. We hope the prototype will demonstrate concretely the value, indeed the urgency, of establishing a sustained system to collect and analyze humanities data. The data will provide scholars, policymakers, and the public with national benchmarks on the state of the humanities in America. It was created in collaboration with the learned societies, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the individual learned societies, and a large group of national humanities organizations. We are especially grateful to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundations for supporting this work. A third goal of the Academy is to advocate for the importance of the humanities in a civil society. Tonight's program examines this topic. I will introduce each of our speakers briefly. In your programs, you have more detailed biographies. Our first speaker is a specialist in the music of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and has been instrumental in bringing an awareness of the humanities to his many leadership roles. As Dean and Provost at Cornell University, and as President of the University of Chicago, he has been a champion of intellectual inquiry and research across disciplines. As President of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, he continues that commitment by leading the organization in its critical support, in fact, unique support, for higher education, scholarship, museums, performing arts, and the environment. Through the innovative applications of new technologies, the Mellon Foundation is also helping to provide a secure foundation for the humanities in today and in the future. I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Don Michael Randle.
Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet includes the observation that, quote, "You cannot write more than a dozen love letters without finding yourself graveled for fresh matter." Reading much that has been written about the state of the humanities in our time, one could begin to have the same feeling. Why should this be the case? Is it necessarily the case? Perhaps the impulse to write about the humanities actually shares something with the impulse to write love letters that we should recognize and be happy about, asserting that both genres deserve continued cultivation, even though novelty is not their primary goal. That shared impulse has a lot to do with hope. Hope that what is written will have an effect on the reader and inspire shared feelings with the author. I'm hopeful that hope may now have its day with respect to a good many things, including the humanities. And I believe that since the presidential election, this hope for the humanities is more widely shared among humanists themselves. I also remember that a character in Sam Shepard's Buried Child says to another, "You're all alike, you hopers." In addressing repeatedly the condition of the humanities, the crisis of the humanities, the neglect of the humanities, the place of the humanities, the utility of the humanities, the future of the humanities, what is it that we humanists are really hoping for? What precisely do we want? Sometimes it seems as if what we want is what some other people have: more money in the form of salaries, leaves, graduate students, research support. Sometimes it seems as if what we want is more authority, which is often closely correlated with money, in the governance of our academic and other institutions. Sometimes it seems as if what we want is as simple as more respect, which of course has its own way of going back to money and authority. The respect of our academic colleagues in other fields, even though we do not bring in big research grants. The respect of our students, even though we cannot guarantee their future employment. The respect of the general public, even though we have trouble describing our contribution to the gross domestic product and to job creation in a period of economic decline, or indeed in any period at all. Stan Katz, in a recent piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, admits to, quote, humanities jealousy, in commenting on the success of advocates for the arts in getting $50 million for the NEA inserted in the stimulus bill, while nothing was done for the NEH. He is surely not alone in feeling this way. But this is as much as anything an index of how easily our feelings are hurt, since although this is a huge increase in funds available to the NEA, it is an amount measurable only at the 10th decimal place as a fraction of the whole of the stimulus effort. And then we really ought to celebrate any increased support for the arts, since the arts ought to be thought of as a province of the humanities. We sometimes whine too much, and we should try to stop it. The remedy to the current state of affairs of the humanities has lately seemed to take an instrumental turn. To be sure, one still hears echoes of the traditional view that the humanities are ends in themselves. But Katz, for example, remarks, quote, "The more important point is that the humanities community has not developed a plausible case for enhanced public support. If we are to make our case to the nation, the community has to articulate its goals and capacities much more clearly than it has done thus far." Andrew Delbanco, also writing in the Chronicle of Higher Education, refers to the traditional view but goes on to say, quote, "There is a certain prideful purity in such a view, but if educators hope for renewed public trust in the value of liberal as opposed to practical or vocational education, we have to come to terms with the utility question one way or another." Soon after, the topic even made it onto the front page of the arts section of the New York Times, where an article largely stimulated by Delbanco's piece was headlined, quote, "In tough times, the humanities must justify their worth." There are, of course, many such justifications, and the 12 or so love letters that one can write about the humanities before running out of new material have stated them very well. The danger here is that we may be tempted to oversell some of these justifications, even in the face of evidence to the contrary, and more important, we may tend to overshadow what must still remain the single most powerful and useful justification for the humanities, namely their contribution to leading a richer and more meaningful life. About this assertion, we must not apologize or even be hesitant. This raises the question of what it is that we really hope for when we hope for the humanities. If what we hope for is that set of activities or disciplines in which people who call themselves humanists engage, we are not hoping for enough. Our deepest hope is surely not simply that there should be more professors of English and philosophy, and the other fields typically lumped together with them, or that these professors should be better paid, or have terms of employment more like those in other walks of life, both inside the academy and out. Nor is it simply that more students, undergraduates and graduates alike, should pursue studies in the humanities departments, whether as concentrations or distribution requirements. Nor is it simply that more people in the business world or in public life should have taken more courses in the humanities in their university years. All of this might be desirable in great degree, but it is clearly not sufficient. We know too many professors of the humanities, too many students who major in the humanities or take courses in the humanities, too many people in the business world or in public life who study the humanities and may even have advanced degrees in the humanities who nevertheless do not display the characteristics that the humanities are said to develop. What we really hope for is a certain quality of mind. Not a body of knowledge or a list of books read or music listened to or of skills developed in the process, but rather a way of life in which the mind never ceases to be filled with wonder at the world and all of its people, in which there is an unquenchable thirst to understand more, to be moved by more kinds of beauty, and to share all of this with one's fellow human beings. In the best of cases, this rises to the level of love. Intellectuals who might be thought to instance what we are hoping for from the humanities cannot necessarily be counted on to do the right thing for other human beings or the planet that we share. Some of them have even been monstrous criminals. If we're really hoping for a certain quality of mind to inhabit the lives of more people, our frame of reference expands very considerably. It obliterates the boundaries between ourselves and those other pursuits of which we might be tempted to be jealous. The arts ought to be a simple case. Of course, the humanities want for the national life, underneath it all, the same thing that the arts want. But in this sense, the humanities and the arts and the sciences are absolutely of a piece. Set aside for the moment the money that it takes to pursue these various activities and the ways in which each at times tries to justify itself by taking up the utility questions with claims of contribution to the gross domestic product or the national defense. The real complaint of the humanities is precisely the same as the real complaint of the sciences. Not enough American kids and the grown-ups that they become want to pursue these fields seriously because other things matter more to them than living the life of the mind. A life in which continuously opening and stretching the mind to ideas, to nature, to other people, is felt clearly and passionately to be the only life worth living. When it comes to the fundamentals of what we've hoped for in the national life, there are not two cultures. The humanities and the sciences are or ought to be in precisely the same place. What to do about this? Colleges and universities are a good place to start, or perhaps to finish, as I will suggest shortly. Too many things about college and university life, often to be sure in response to serious pressures from beyond their walls, act to reify the notion that in the life of the mind there are two cultures. Let us stipulate that there are both know-nothing humanists and know-nothing scientists, each of whom acts as if there is nothing of consequence to learn from the other. Each group needs to be more modest about the power of its own modes of inquiry and what might be said in consequence to constitute knowledge worth having. The worthiest goal for us all would be to instill in every last student the profoundest sense of regret that one will never know as much as one would want to know about either nature or people and the interactions within and between the two. This is best taught by example. College and university professors should not principally be experts in the conventional sense. Rather, they should be experts principally on the limits of their expertise. But we must also recognize, without giving in to them, that there are limits to what we can accomplish with the raw material, as it were, that we are given. Some horses will simply decline to drink. Aristotle taught many years ago in the Nicomachean Ethics that the goal of life is happiness, as distinct from mere pleasure, and that the contemplative life is the life most likely to produce this happiness. Aristotle has said it all. The contemplative life is just what we're after in American society. All we need to do is get every undergraduate to read the Nicomachean Ethics, thanks to a major grant from the NEH to professors in the humanities everywhere, and we will have solved the problem. I venture to say that no one has ever decided to live the contemplative life on account of reading the Nicomachean Ethics or any other so-called good book. At best, I think such books fall on fertile soil and satisfy a longing for something that precedes its specific formulation. And then, later, one may not remember the specifics of a particular book, but be left with a thrilling sense of a longing both satisfied and enhanced. We could all also tell the story of the transforming high school teacher, but we would be bound to reach a similar conclusion. For a start, many of our classmates, in college as well as in high school, were simply not transformed by the very same experience. Rather than lead you through more steps in this regression, let me simply say that schools alone cannot do the jobs that need doing for us, and furthermore, we will not be able to fix schools if we cannot fix families. Every child comes into the world hardwired with curiosity, and our society works steadily at beating it out of them. By the time many of them reach school, it is already too late. Recent work at the University of Chicago shows that infants exposed to gestural communication before they begin to acquire language and develop cognitively at a greater rate than those that have not been stimulated through gesture. A sad part of the findings correlates this with family income. When we hope for the humanities, we are hoping for something really big, for something about the quality of the nation's and the world's intellectual life and about the way in which each of us goes about the world. It is not, except secondarily, about the things that might make us jealous of other fields of endeavor. Thus, the role of professional humanists is in many ways secondary as well, however important that role is. The professional humanist is on the long end of a pipeline that can only strive, by example, don't forget, not by erudition alone, to improve on what is coming along through it. If we really care about the humanities and believe in their importance in the lives of individuals and society, we will need to find the ways to be part of a much larger effort that seeks to capture young minds from birth and then nurture them steadily. If our colleagues at the University of Chicago are right, Poverty may even be part of our problem as humanists. If we decline to be locked up in the ivory tower, but insist on being recognized and rewarded for playing an important role in society at large, then we will need to leave the ivory tower on our own recognizance and find roles to play on a much broader terrain. In this, humanists, artists, and scientists will all very much need one another. We are all alike, we hopers, but that is our very strength. Thank you.
At a meeting the Academy sponsored here in Washington 2 years ago, Don encouraged us, quote, "Talk and act as if we truly believe that the humanities and the arts matter and underlie the deepest foundation of a democratic society." Don is always someone who talks and acts in a manner that is consistent with that fundamental belief and hope, and he continues to lead us in that effort. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is universally recognized as one of the nation's most learned, thoughtful, and humane jurists. At Concord High School in New Hampshire, his classmates named him the most literary student, as well as the most likely to succeed. Legend has it that the only time that he got into trouble as a teenager was when he stayed past closing time at the local historical society. Later, in addition to pursuing his career in the law and being a major in the humanities at Harvard, he became a trustee and officer of the New Hampshire Historical Society. So you see, his deep appreciation of history was nurtured very young, perhaps through a gesture, but he'll have to tell you, and it continues to this day. It is my special honor to introduce the Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, David Souter.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you all. My contribution this afternoon is to illustrate a grand theme, and do that by a limited example culled from my own niche in life. My example will show simply this. History provides an antidote to cynicism about the past, as we, and I now speak as a judge, as we constantly re-examine what the Constitution requires. A person who has no sense of historical change outside the law cannot understand why old decisions of constitutional law could have escaped the illumination expressed in later cases that sometimes decisively break from them. A person possessed of a sense of history can understand this. Some changes in constitutional results, of course, are easy to follow. The 26th Amendment gave the vote to 18-year-olds in state elections and changed the 1970 ruling in Oregon v. Mitchell. The valid exercise of Congress's power under the Commerce Clause understandably expanded as the network of commerce grew from the days of the framers. But some constitutional development comes not from straightforward changes in the stated law or rule to be applied, and not from obvious modification in the immediate conditions that are brought forward for the application of legal rules and principles. In these less easily understood instances, change comes about because judges evaluate significant facts differently from the way their predecessors viewed similar facts. The later judges discover some relevance to a constitutional rule where earlier judges saw none, or they find an importance in some fact that once was thought trivial. In all sorts of ways, the later judges see things that earlier judges did not see, or they deal with facts that were not faced in earlier adjudication. To explain these kinds of cases fully, a person has to know what it is that changes judicial perception from one age to another. It may be differing individual experiences, but more likely it is differences in the experience of the broader society over time. What an appellate judge perceives depends on the common experience that he assimilates and brings with him to the bench. And herein lies a problem. For judges are not very good at explaining this background or at explaining how their common background is different from their predecessors. The judges may do a fine job of accounting for the salient facts of a single case before them, and they may be lucid enough stating the legal doctrine that bears on the facts. Giving explanations like these are what judges do. But in cases that break largely from the past, these explanations can leave something missing. For they may very well fail to explain why judges in an earlier case could not see what contemporary judges do see. And it is in solving this problem that historians can come to the rescue. For one of history's jobs is to explain how it is that judges and other people view things differently over time. History does this by recounting, more or less, by recounting objectively knowable facts and explaining how they show the ways in which an earlier time differs from a later time. And this is why a sense of history can make a new departure in the law acceptable or at least comprehensible to a degree that explanations of current conditions and current doctrine alone are not able to do. And this is also why that same sense of history can explain how judges of the past can seem to have been so wrong. We have a great example of this kind of historical explanation. For the most famous case in 20th century American law produced one of those constitutional upheavals that really cannot be comprehended in a state of historical amnesia. The 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education is of course, what I'm thinking of. The decision that repudiated the doctrine of the 1896 case of Plessy and Ferguson that racial segregation by force of law is constitutional if equal as well as separate provision is made for each race. Although both Brown and Plessy applied the 14th Amendment with its guarantees of citizenship, equal privileges or immunities, due process, equal protection, there were differences between the two cases, and some of them are easy to follow as far as they go. The Brown court explained the significance of segregation in public education, whereas Plessy had dealt with trade cars. There were technical doctrinal differences, too, in theories of police powers of the states and the ability of the 14th Amendment guarantees to trump those exercises of those police powers. But what strikes a reader as their most remarkable difference turns on what the judges thought about the implication of the mandatory separation. And these statements place doctrinal explanation in the shade, and the contrast leaves us shaking our heads. I'm going to do some quoting. The majority opinion in Plessy said that, and I am now quoting the court, the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument consists in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the state law, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. End of quote. The majority opinion in Brown, of course, rejected this, saying, and again I quote, that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Close quote. Lawyers have argued since Brown came down whether it overruled Plessy or merely distinguished it on the facts. But one cannot read Brown without knowing that the two courts held fundamentally different perceptions of the significance of enforced separation. The perception of the Brown Court strikes us very forcefully as being intuitively right. We can read both the Plessy and the Brown opinions as carefully as we can, and we are left asking how the Plessy majority could have failed to see the meaning of the act of separation, and how it could have failed to see the inherent inequality of even a formally identical railroad car with another one. Neither opinion gives us the answer, and we are left wondering what we are supposed to think about the Plessy judges. Must we conclude that the 8 members of the Plessy majority were psychologically obtuse, or morally cretinous, or just deliberately dishonest? These are the questions that history addresses. And this is what history tells us. The Plessy judges were living in an era of racism that was not only intense, but was abetted by quite serious claims to scientific support. Those claims of science had disappeared in the age of the Brown judges, who had lived through Hitler and could see where assumptions of racial superiority could lead. The Plessy opinion was written more than a decade after Reconstruction had abruptly ended, at a time when there would have been neither federal power nor executive will to enforce a decision striking down the Louisiana law in question in that case. The Brown judges had witnessed the integration of the armed forces. They had already required racial integration in law schools, and they did not see enforcement of their decision as impossible. The Plessy judges remembered personally when some schools were segregated in the North, when slavery was maintained throughout the South, and when a federal fugitive slave law enforced it. Viewed against chattel slavery, a separate railroad car may not have looked the way it did 60 years later, which may explain why Plessy was hardly noticed in the press when it was decided. It did not create a ripple. The Brown judges no longer had the image of slavery as the background for a segregated school, and their time was the age of Cold War, when the press did report the claims of domestic and worldwide communism that the United States was a racist nation dedicated to suppressing black people, which explains why judges who might take refuge in precedent could not look away from the inconvenient fact of their day. That said, history still leaves us appalled by Plessy and where it led. And it still leaves us inspired by Brown and by the watershed of decency which it began. But history also explains that the Plessy majority could not see as clearly what we can see, or evaluate significance with the certainty that we can do that, or face facts and deal with them as readily as the Brown Court did, and as easily as we can imagine facing them. And history teaches that in place of cynicism, we can acknowledge the human limitations of those Plessy judges and the humanity, ultimately, of the judicial institution. It teaches us to avoid the presumption of those who confuse the present with the past. We need to learn these lessons, because where history's understanding is missing, cynicism will take its place. And because cynicism about one institution of government at one time may not remain contained to that institution or confined to government simply at that time. And because governments that are not accorded legitimacy cannot govern. That's what's at stake. So we cannot dispense with the historical way of looking at the world in front of us, which is why we have to make it an article of faith that schools should teach from history books, and teachers should take the lead in developing a sense of history in every mind they can open. If the people of coming of age do develop that faculty of taking the longer view, they will at least be in a position someday to understand how the consequences of the constitutional promises can change as the nation's past recedes, and as receding it leaves men and women able to perceive what an earlier generation could not so clearly see or face so readily. And they will not become cynical or discouraged without just cause.
Thank you so much for your eloquent reminder of the tapestry of history in which we all live and are connected. Our next speaker made her impact in the world of high tech at the Microsoft Corporation. She went on to become Chief Executive Officer of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she helped to craft the foundation's agenda for equity for all peoples of the world in education, poverty, and public health. She was recently named chair of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution, one of the nation's premier custodians of humanities and culture, and she will speak to us today about her journey to the intersection of science and culture. Ms. Patty Stonecipher.
Thank you, and thank you, Leslie, for the introduction, and many thanks to the Academy. Thank you also to George Washington University and President Knapp for hosting us here today. Well, you have already heard from two very wise individuals, and you have one more on this panel, and it's a privilege to actually present alongside of them. And while many of you here tonight, as well as my fellow panelists, have spent your careers contributing to the humanities, I spent the first 20 years of my adult career in high tech. In fact, when I first met the family and friends of my soon-to-be husband, who is a journalist, he would gleefully tell them, "It turns out I love a girl who is great at math," as if that made me an interesting yet somewhat bizarre creature that he'd found in Seattle and brought back here to the district in order to present something of extra interest to his more literary friends. This is not a new response to those of us who live in the world of math and science. In fact, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the scientist and novelist C.P. Snow's famous lecture at Cambridge from May of 1959. At that time, as you all well know, he described a specific gulf, saying literary intellectuals at one side and at the other scientists, and between the two, a gulf of mutual incomprehension. 50 years later, it is vitally important that we do far more to minimize that stubborn mutual incomprehension. And I've been very fortunate, as Leslie said, in my career to have worked on both sides of that gulf, at Microsoft, at the Gates Foundation, and now in my role as chair at the Smithsonian. And so when I came to Microsoft in the 1980s, it was definitely on the far side of the gulf. The goal was a computer on every desk and in every home. And the subtext was running Microsoft software. They didn't ever say that subtext aloud, but that certainly was the purpose for the institution. And at the beginning, we were dealing with very expert users, programmers like ourselves, sometimes accountants, and occasionally a lawyer. We wanted to expand our reach to reach more of society, but we knew we had to do a better job shaping technology to support telling stories, to engage more of our citizens. And so we partnered with DreamWorks, and Steven Spielberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and David Geffen became part of our everyday vocabulary. One day, I was with Bill Gates while he was showing off a prototype of what we thought was a compelling example of an interactive movie to these three creative geniuses. And I'm sitting next to David Geffen, who, if you didn't notice before this election cycle, is known as a notorious truth teller. And I lean over and ask him, what does he think of it? And his response to me was, "You know I love you, Patty, but keep your day job." We knew then that we were going to have to do more making the technology actually bridge that gulf. And in fact, Microsoft continues to work to bridge that gulf today. Thankfully, I didn't listen to Geffen, and I did quit my day job and moved on to an exciting one at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And since our very start in the 1990s, our vision was very clear and probably shared by you, that all lives have equal value and that everyone should have the opportunity for a healthy and productive life. We decided that, given our backgrounds and our beliefs about the world and the century that we live in, we should see if we could bend the arc of new science and technology, which historically serves the richest among us decades before serving the rest, to instead reach the poor and serve their needs. Working towards that purpose in various parts of the world, pursuing new drugs, new diagnostics, new vaccines to improve health, or a myriad of other life solutions, I again encountered that gulf of mutual incomprehension, but with far greater consequences. At many times it felt more like a wall, and learned how essential it really is that no matter how good the science, to understand a culture in order to support the needs of the culture was essential. In fighting to end the AIDS pandemic, we learned both in India and Africa how big a foe stigma would be. Traditional health education made few inroads in breaking the silence about sex. And that silence meant that knowledge of how to prevent infection was not shared by parents, was not shared in schools, was not shared between partners. And so besides funding R&D for vaccine and microbicides and other biological innovations, we found ourselves funding radio soap operas with detectives who became HIV positive mid-episode, mid-series, and became national heroes and vehicles for introducing the conversation into the home and into the kitchen table. We did the same thing, funding street theater, funding poetry contests, funding all kinds of performances that would make opening this discussion and opening this pandemic and its consequences an individual and personal consequence. In Haiti, I have had the pleasure of working with Paul Farmer, a Harvard-trained physician who's both MD and anthropologist. He has personally worked to close that gulf, cultivating extraordinary relationships with both traditional healers and voodoo priests. And while Paul has created full-service hospitals across the country, he knows that if patients only come to him as a last result, after relying too long on traditional healers, they will suffer too much and often die. I attended a regular meeting between Paul, his staff, and those voodoo practitioners where they exchanged knowledge. Paul speaking to them how to recognize the symptoms of TB and HIV, and them describing where they thought they could help with the maladies and problems of those that they served, and dividing up responsibilities and recognizing that there was a role for both of them to play in this community. I've been part of dozens of stories like this, where culture and science failed to go hand in hand and have seen the cost, whether they were bed nets used as wedding veils, new latrines used as potting sheds, or polio drops undelivered because of a challenge with the religious leadership. And I learned that scientists and aid workers that allow that gulf of incomprehension to exist have put a real price on that gulf, and it often is the price of human life. It can be bridged, it must be bridged, and together the cultures are working to create that bridge. And I'm now participating in a new culture as the chair of the Board of Regents at the Smithsonian, and it's also changing lives. Its mission, unchanged since its founding since 1846, is of course the increase and diffusion of knowledge. And we have a new secretary, Wayne Clough, a scientist by training but a humanist also. As president of Georgia Tech, he created not one but two endowed chairs of poetry, recognizing that even on a campus known for its extraordinary focus on technology, that they needed to close the gulf. And now Dr. Clough is committed to using the latest technology to reach new audiences and expand access to the Smithsonian's scholars and vast collections. 24 million people walked through a door marked Smithsonian in the last year, but nearly 200 million access the Smithsonian, its collections, its knowledge, its scholars via the internet or other kinds of electronic delivery. Smithsonian is beginning to bridge the gulf in other ways. This is the February issue of the Smithsonian Magazine, presenting both Lincoln and Darwin, who shared the same birthday 200 years ago, and it represents a pan-institutional effort to reach out to teachers, to students, to adults, to bring all of the institutions, scholars, and efforts together to really get the critical understanding of these issues out together. The online seminar that we held on Lincoln for Teachers was a huge success, with one teacher responding that she learned how to tie art, histories, stamps, photos, websites, and Lincoln together in a way that actually really caught the attention of her students on this important historical topic for the first time. That's the power of bridging the gulf, bringing new energy and attention to these issues that we all care about so much. Our next seminar will be on global warming, and we hope that it will be bigger and better, tying the arts and the sciences and the energy of education together. I do wonder whether the exceptional crowds we are seeing now at the Natural History Museum for the orchids exhibit is because of the thousands of beautiful orchids in their 15th annual exhibit, or because this particular exhibit is positioned as orchids through the eyes of Darwin. The number of aha moments that you can actually participate in, see happen in the exhibit with both students and adults going through is enough to tell you that people want to bridge that gulf, because it doesn't just cause the gap, but it causes new levels of insight and knowledge to open up. One last highly relevant example is over at the American Art Museum. We have a fantastic exhibit that I encourage you to go see, 1934, A New Deal for Artists. And it, of course, represents the public works of art program that started 75 years ago, created during the depths of the Great Depression. And it's reminding everyone that goes through that this nation has endured tough times before and emerged the better for it in the arts, in the humanities, and in business. And we hope we will again. The good news is that in an updated essay just 4 years after that 1959 essay, C.P. Snow introduced the idea of the third culture. And with the people represented here, as well as the scholars and collections at the Smithsonian, the leadership there, the things going on across this country, I really do believe that many, many of us recognize that a culture that bridges that divide is essential, not just to the continued health of the humanities, or the continued health of the sciences, but to the country's continued role as an innovation leader during these challenging times and during the decades ahead. One last personal note, which is my husband over the last decade has since meant many, many math girls, and I have certainly improved my writing skills substantially. So thank you very much.
Just as Patty's journey has taken her from technology to the humanities, our next speaker has been tireless in finding novel ways to apply technology to the humanities. A historian of the American South, he is the author of 10 books, as well as the creator of the award-winning website, The Valley of the Shadow. Using digital archives, original letters, diaries, newspapers, census, and church records, it tells the story of one northern and one southern community in the Civil War era. He has become an evangelist for digital history and for using it to tell stories. I am very pleased to introduce the president of the University of Richmond, President Edward Ayers.
Thank you, Leslie, and thanks to my distinguished predecessors at the lectern for reminding us of why all these issues matter. And for reminding us how complicated they are. Now, humanists claim that one of the things that we do is teach people how to deal with complexity. And that's fortunate because, as you can hear, there's so many vectors and layers to all of this that finding our way is going to be an interesting challenge. Now, fortunately, we have the new Humanities Indicators Project to give our conversation a kind of proportion and a history and a context we've not had before. So I want to ground what I'm talking about in what we've learned from this remarkable new project from the American Academy. Now, it turns out that some of the things that we think are in decline, such as students' interest in what we have to offer, as measured by our share of enrollments, for example, or the number of scholarly books we publish, or an audience for our work outside the traditional classroom, simply are not in decline. Some things we think are in trouble are in fact in trouble, particularly finding secure jobs for our new doctorates who've worked so hard to master their complicated fields. And some things we're not worrying about might be worth more anxiety than have been directed to them so far. The humanities are all that their proponents claim them to be. All that you've heard in these eloquent addresses are true. They're true in the practical terms of preparing people for lives of purpose and accomplishment. But we are not reaching large numbers of first-generation immigrant, minority, or poor students with the wonder that is the humanities. It is time for us to reach out to them in every way available to them. Now, that's a lot to cover in 10 minutes, so let me dig in. Now, the Humanities Indicators Project describes, quote, the great and varied archive of the human record as the subject of humanist work. That seems exactly right to me, especially if we added growing to great and varied. Little that humans have thought or recorded is useless. It only awaits its time and its interpreter for its use to be revealed to us. In a heartening development, Americans have never been more interested in other parts of the world, desperate to understand places they neglected for generations. And fortunately, there are humanists who are patiently studying those places who can now help us to understand them. The archive becomes greater and more varied every day. The humanities are the secular memory of the human race. Like individual memory, much of this collective memory, much of the time, seems irrelevant, a kind of static or interference that gets in the way of us doing the immediate task before us. And, like personal memory, that larger memory will fade if we permit it to. Like personal memory, our collective memory plays tricks on us, turning itself into fables and self-serving stories and flattering mythologies. Memory work can be pleasant, like flipping through an old photo album of pictures we love and want to remember. But memory work can also be harrowing as we uncover and dwell on things we do not particularly want to remember, but simply must. That's what the humanities do. Though the phrase the humanities bears the patina of an ancient Western tradition, the aggregation of disciplines bearing that name is only about 100 years old and is largely an American invention. The concept grew slowly, taking off mainly after World War II, and the number of undergraduates taking degrees in humanities reached its peak in 1972. Like American higher education in general, the humanities suffered between 1975 and 1987, but in that year, undergraduate enrollments in the humanities began another ascent, and with a few plateaus along the way, have continued that ascent to today. Now, anxiety about losing out to other fields notwithstanding, and as Don says, that's what much of the conversation about the crisis, impending or real or past, about the humanities is really all about. The relative position of the humanities within colleges and universities has not changed appreciably in the last 20 years. Enrollments in business programs float about 10 percentage points above all other undergraduate degrees, as they have for decades, and vocational programs still attract growing numbers of students. But the social sciences, the natural sciences, social services, and the humanities, each of us, consistently enroll about 12% of undergraduates, as many on one side of the culture as on the other. The humanities occupy the middle of the pack on most measures of disciplinary health, from the ethnic and gender diversity of the faculty and students to the salaries and degree of satisfaction of graduates. The more exclusive and expensive the college or university, by and large, the more established the relative position of the humanities. That will be important. So we'll return to that. In the meantime, humanistic information is proliferating on screens of all sorts. As of last week, thousands of monographs can be made to appear on my iPhone for $9 in about 30 seconds each, including one of my own, in case any of you would like to rush out and buy many of them. The Library of Congress and universities and libraries and businesses all over the world give us access to the humanistic archive in ways unimaginable only 20 years ago. Thanks to online journals and websites and videos and inclusive electronic conversations of all sorts, humanists enjoy a range of venues and audiences unimaginable to those who wrote for the much romanticized heyday of the public intellectual for a few small magazines. Humanists, like the rest of us, have not figured out how to make full use of this sudden abundance. Like most of us, with most of this onrush, we are rather bedazzled and unsophisticated consumers. We have not yet changed our modes of scholarship or teaching appreciably in the face of this bounty, but we will. We have, after all, the entire record of the human experience to explore and present in a new set of media that stretch instantaneously all over the world. Now, humanists are not quick to change, and if you live in the world of memory as your life purpose, that perhaps is not surprising and may not even be worrisome. But these opportunities and the pressures associated with them are too compelling for us to resist forever. In the meantime, other people are reaching out to the humanities. Highly motivated adult students fill classes of all kinds, from community colleges to the most elite schools, eager to seize what they only glimpsed or did not understand fully or missed entirely as 19-year-olds, and now realize that. The teaching company now offers more than 250 courses, most of them in the humanities, and most of them taught by professors prominent in their disciplines. Though we are losing book reviews in newspapers at an alarming rate, I really wish we would stop, millions of people seek out the humanities in whatever form they appear, from classrooms and museums to humanities institutes to television and radio and the web. People want the humanities. People need the humanities. People demand the humanities. That said, no matter how popular some aspects of the humanities may become, the humanities require dedication and focus, and so they require colleges and universities and classrooms and libraries. Scholarship, like other kinds of research, requires specialization, even hyper-specialization, sometimes in topics that can seem trivial to those outside the tradition. This expert knowledge is hard to gain, and so many of our PhD students take almost a decade to master the languages and techniques that permit them to write their studies. We admire this kind of special knowledge in science and medicine, but seem to think it's somehow inappropriate for the humanities. It is not. It is essential. And that specialization is not at odds with aggressive democratization. These are false dichotomies, the academy and the world. They must have each other. We have to know what we're talking about before we start talking, or we are of no real use and maybe even of danger. And the humanities are more useful than they claim. We are almost too deferential. Writing a novel, painting a painting, or performing a piece of music can, of course, be wonderful. But making sense of many novels, or finding visual patterns across an entire era, or spreading word of long-neglected music is also worthy. A great teacher of English changes lives in ways both subtle and profound, year in and year out, long after a much-praised novel has passed its brief season of popularity. Appreciating one kind of understanding does not mean we need to denigrate others. Business, medicine, science, and law reach out to the humanities. We should do the same. New programs in medical humanities, in science, technology, and the humanities, in the ethics of business, and law and the humanities generally come from our colleagues in the professional schools who know what we have to offer. But less often are we reaching out to them. They would be happy to hear from us, but we are diffident, too unassuming, or self-absorbed. But we have things to offer. The humanities bring profoundly useful gifts of broadened vision. They prepare people to see the largest context and consequences of things, to make subtle distinctions, create new experiences, to deal with ambiguity and novelty and complexity. But young people who come from backgrounds that do not give them reason to believe they will have the opportunity to exercise those powers often avoid and even resent the humanities and the time and energy they consume. We have allowed the humanities to become perceived as prereqs, obstacles to real study, delaying tactics, while what people really want to know waits. Ironically, the most favored students in this country understand the value of the humanities because they see their value demonstrated with each graduating class. As people go off to every kind of career or professional study that does not align with what they studied as undergraduate majors. To be a classics major of an elite school is to see many opportunities ahead. But it takes bravery to be a classics major at a school where Wall Street does not come to recruit, or where the best graduate schools do not seem open. One can hardly blame them. It should not be surprising that African American students, finally given a chance at college, major in business far more often than the humanities. For first-generation immigrant or working-class students, pre-vocational or vocational majors make more immediate sense, even though such majors often limit long-term flexibility and opportunity. If these trends continue, the humanities may become the exclusive property of those with especially large amounts of personal, cultural, or institutional capital. An unappreciated crisis of the humanities is that they may not reach those who would find them most useful, who would see the greatest difference in their lives as a result of seeing with the magnification and broadening they offer. The current crisis is exactly the wrong time to give up on the humanities or the uniquely American faith in broad education to prepare us for the unexpected and unintended. The crisis does not lie in scholarly fashions or canon wars or atrophied scholarship. Rather, the crisis lies in opportunities unfulfilled in groups the humanities are not reaching. Precisely because the humanities prepare people to lead expansive and thoughtful lives, we must find a way to connect with people of all kinds, of all backgrounds and ages and aspirations, in all kinds of media and all kinds of contexts. The humanities cannot afford to be smug or cautious, elite or timid. They must put themselves at play, at risk in a world that needs what the humanities have to offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, and please join me in thanking all of our speakers again. I would like to give the members of our panel an opportunity to begin the conversation with each other, and then I want to reach out to the audience and ask some of you to pose questions. And I'd like to take the prerogative of being moderator to at least pose one question, since we are on the cusp of Humanities Day on the Hill. Congress has begun to understand that science and technology are critical as economic engines. Even the arts, as was mentioned earlier, has been able to make a case for itself in the economic stimulus package. Can I ask you to consider how my colleagues who will be visiting with members of Congress might make an equally compelling case for public support of the humanities? Could I ask Don, would you maybe start that off?
I have not emphasized the instrumental argument, quite the contrary. I've said that we have to go beyond the sort of instrumental argument, but I don't mean by that to say that there aren't plenty of good ones. And so I'd start simply by echoing something that Justice Souter talked about, namely the importance of the study of history as crucial to all of the kinds of things that lie before us. Surely, members of Congress ought to be persuaded that we can't wait until a war starts or we start one to learn the languages and the history of the people that we're going to have to deal with. And I would say it would be equally useful to know something of the culture and languages of the people we might hope were our allies in such a war. Congress, I would hope, was open to the notion that we need a deep investment in the intellectual infrastructure of the country, and that means investing in foreign language teaching in primary school rather than waiting until young people are over their best language learning years, and ensuring that we do something about teaching history broadly. We need to open it up more than it has sometimes been open, and to suggest that it's not only the canon of old books by white people, but that it is essential for us in this world to know about people all around the globe. And we need to invest in that kind of study from the youngest primary grades right through college and graduate school.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Patty? No?
Well, I would just say that I would second what Don said. I think that that the amount of money, the importance that was put on the preservation of the funding level, increase from the federal level, but to ensure the states have the funding to keep primary education at a stable state at this time is an extremely important. The Secretary of Education still does have funds available to do extraordinary things to improve our standards, and I believe that our standards need to include a level and quality and expectation in this area, and I believe the efforts at reinforcing standards will give us some room to say what is an appropriate level of understanding of histories and humanities for our students. I also say that it's a great situation that we have two cabinet members interested in this. Our Secretary of State has said that that besides defense, diplomacy is a critical importance. She has a long history of being a strong supporter of education, would understand, I think, the case that Don made for the fact that having students in the future that can speak the languages, that can understand the cultures is a critical part of a long-term strengthening of our diplomacy.
I first like to thank people for making such a strong case for my own discipline of history, which I neglected out of a sense of ecumenical outreach. I would encourage them to realize what a wonderful set of allies they already have in place in the forms of the organizations dedicated to strengthening the humanities in this country. And I'm not just saying that because I look around and see faces of friends that I recognize across the board, but we have the means to take advantage of an investment in the humanities. You have dedicated expert people in every community in this country and from all the professional organizations. And so it's not just a matter of scattering the money on the waters, but rather they have allies already who could do remarkable things with the support.
Two random thoughts, and by the way, I should start with a full disclosure. I'm going to talk for a second about an approach that you might make in dealing with members of Congress. You should know that I have been on the Judicial Salary Committee for the last couple of years, and the lesson to be learned from that is whatever I tell you, do the opposite. The two random thoughts are first, at the risk of being a one-noter. This is a matter, I guess, of tactics, but I do know for a fact that there are a number of history buffs and historians in the Congress, particularly in the House, and that's not the worst note you could sound if you want to play a solo in your dealings. The second thought is one which is probably of no use here on the eve of your visitation, but I would like to underscore something that has run through several comments this afternoon, and that is the case for the humanities is not the case for a narrow constituency. And there's a sameness, oddly enough, in dealing with the problems of the humanities and in dealing with the problem of judicial independence. And that sameness is that we both, humanists and judges, tend to say they need to know more about us. One of the things that I learned, and it seems so obvious, but it was extraordinarily illuminating, came as a result of a conference that Justice O'Connor and Justice Breyer were the sparks for a couple of years ago over at Georgetown Law School on the subject of judicial independence. Most of us, I at least, went in on the assumption that somehow the ignorance of what the judiciary does is the problem that somehow has to be addressed. Almost kind of a Platonic theory. If people outside the discipline know enough, they will do the right thing. What I learned, what we all learned, was that the problem is not a problem of ignorance of the judiciary. The problem is one of pervasive ignorance of government. And in practical terms, it comes down to something that I paralleled in my remarks. When I was a kid, excuse me, in the 8th and 9th grades, everybody took civics. It was dull as ditch water, but by the time it was over, one knew something about the 3 branches and so on, and there was at least a structure upon which, as one grew and learned this and that, knowledge could be hung. That is no longer true, and in fact, coincidentally, Justice O'Connor has established a new website on civic education that informs us that, with respect both to civics and history, approximately 50% of the school districts in the United States teach neither. What we came away knowing, however, from that conference a couple of years ago is that the problem that we had to face and deal with was not one of the ignorance of the judiciary, but the ignorance of governmental structure as a whole. And what we have heard from several speakers this afternoon is that the humanities will not cure whatever its problems may be by emphasizing simply the humanities. The problem is to place the humanities in broader education. And as I said, that is a lesson at such a high level of generality that it may well be of no use to anyone, for you must, I presume at this point, have your pitches pretty much ready to give. But for long-term thinking about approaching the Congress, it seems to me that what we have heard from several speakers this afternoon is a key to something very important. The humanities is not just holding out the humanities tin cup, although that cup seems to be rather more empty than some nearby cups these days. But the humanities is in this together with all of the other categories of education.
Thank you.
Let me say one more word about history, because I think Ed touched on a very important point early in his remarks when he observed the ways in which sometimes history is a way of creating a kind of mythology about ourselves with which we're comfortable. One of the things we need to invest in if we invest in history is not just sending young people out to grade schools and high schools and making kids memorize the names and dates of lots of famous people, but we need to invest in original historical research by scholars that develops a more subtle understanding of history. Because a history that adheres simply to the old mythology that we have made about ourselves can, in fact, be a dangerous thing in the world.
Do any of you have questions for each other before I open this up to the floor? Okay, then I will entertain questions, but we have 4 rules at the Academy. When I recognize you, please wait for a microphone. State your name, be brief, and make sure there's a question mark at the end of your sentence. Yes. Yeah? Wait for a microphone. Is there one?
Hi, my name is Doug Richardson, and I have a question that is both for Justice Souter and for Ed Ayers. Both of you have emphasized the need to have a broad constituency, relying not simply on the humanities, but integration and reaching out in multiple ways. I'm a geographer myself, and Ed and I have had some chances to work together in the past. And I think that making these linkages beyond the narrow disciplines of the humanities and looking at the ways in which all disciplines are being transformed right now and trying to become a part of that interaction is really a great way to strengthen and bring the humanities a much broader audience, as Ed has suggested. And my question to you both is, what sorts of concrete ways do you see that happening?
If I were, I haven't thought of that until you raised the question, and I didn't come in even prepared with any thinking about it. One thing that occurs to me, though, is I think I would, if I were trying to develop a strategy overall, my strategy would be an analog of the old rule that a little learning is a dangerous thing, and the strategy would be partial learning is a dangerous thing. We've had quite a number of examples of partial learning thrust at us in the last few years. A very simple example is that we know a lot more about military defense than we know about the relationships among the divisions within the Muslim world. We have a State Department that I have read frequently does not have very many Arabic speakers in it. And one could go on with examples of lacunae in sort of what might be called publicly serviceable knowledge. And I think if I have to have a starting point, it would be partial knowledge is extraordinarily dangerous.
I appreciate you bringing this up, Doug, since I hosted a conference last week sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities on visualizing the past, which brought together geographers and humanists, because as we think about these new screens that I was talking about, perhaps the most ubiquitous and new one are GPS, global positioning devices with all kinds, which got me here today, in fact, talking to me, get in the left lane. And that it's a new form of context that reminds us that the humanities are not just words or pictures, but also space, that we need to read landscapes as well, and that suddenly, when you have these layers of information that are suddenly available to you to tell you what has happened on this place before, suddenly we can broaden our vision in a new way. When it goes back to the two cultures question that Patty brought up, cartography is a lost art. It used to be an art. Now we have sort of a scientific version of how we deal with geography, and humanists deal with it in the imagination. We can now, thanks to these new technologies, begin to have a new kind of conversation in which we connect some of the most ancient human desires and technologies to understand ourselves is locating imagination and place in the same sphere. So I think it's one of the most exciting opportunities that we have that would have been impossible without these new screens that suddenly let us see where we are in place, and now we need to understand where we are in time.
Because of the lights, I'm having a hard time seeing the hands. Amika?
My name is Emiko Onukitioni. I was delighted to hear some of the positive development at the university level about the humanities. Where I come from, regardless of the major, one cannot be taken seriously unless you knew Kant, Nietzsche, some Greco-Roman philosophers, or literary figures, Andre Gide, or whoever. And that we never learned these in classrooms. And it was in the air, so to speak. And what I was trying to get at is that how can we make it so that even earlier on that people recognize the richness and the importance of this philosophy, literature, and what have you. And one very good experiment in Japan is teaching almost early teenagers philosophy and all of that. And that seems to be successful. So my question is, how can we emphasize non-formalized and earlier education in which we can introduce humanities? Thank you.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
I'm a believer in preschool. And in fact, one of the single greatest, best predictors of SAT scores and similar things, without wishing to put too much emphasis on that, one of the single best predictors of accomplishment in those zones is whether you were read to as a child. And I sometimes think about wonderful programs like Teach for America, young people passionately going into the schools. Imagine if you could send enough young people into homes to make sure that every little kid got read to. There again, of course, you're talking about social stratification. So rich people are more likely to read to their kids than some of the most desperately poor. But it's you can't name an age at which it's too early to start, I think.
Nor an age at which it's too late. So I will take the other end of the lifespan. You're talking about what's in the air now. We were chatting in the green room beforehand. What's in the air now? What's in the backpacks of the students that I know are Paul Farmer and other things about how do you change the world. And then you can watch people begin with this relatively applied perspective and then realize, I guess I better know something about the history, culture, language, literature, music of Africa if I'm going to do that. And then that leads into questioning about how does that ramify into our own culture? And you can just watch. So I guess what I would say is that we have to go with where the people who are around us who might benefit from the humanities are and throw the shortest spark that we can. That would be my recommendation for that.
The gentleman in the back.
Al Milliken, have any of you witnessed firsthand a shared new experience in the humanities change or alter an important scientific, legal, technical, or academic decision by any of your colleagues?
No.
I think I already made it clear that in doing the kinds of applied application of science and technology at the Gates Foundation, we learned very on that wasn't building software, right? There was something more to learn. And I'll just give you one little example of the ways that we've begun learning, because, of course, you tend to attract like people at the beginning of the process. So many of us are science and technology. But before we opened an office in China, we were lucky enough to have Mimi Gardner-Gates, who happens to be a specialist in Chinese porcelain, and came and did an extended study for all of us on the history and poetry and arts of China in order to help us understand better not just what did we need to do about the AIDS pandemic and the drug trafficking and the intersections of those with HIV, but if we were going to be working with the government, we needed to understand the context and the history. If we were going to be working with the peoples, the culture and the values and the philosophy. And I actually think it really changed the introduction of a Gates Foundation office in China, and that our partnerships, both with the public health community, but also with the government and with the citizens in general, is very different, and that our shared scientific goals will advance at a significantly better pace. Because, to Don's point about being open to the wonders of the world, it's important in China to be open to the wonders. You may not agree with all of them, but that open eyes to a broader part certainly helped us get beyond addressing what do you do about infection rates and AIDS.
I would say all the time, albeit in a less dramatic fashion, in the relatively circumscribed sphere of a university president, building buildings and noticing how developers, planners, architects bring to bear, are hungry for humanistic knowledge to set the context of what they're going to do, or the people who run the school systems, or the people I deal with in business The thing that looks the most like the kind of history I do is the business page, in which they're looking constantly, scanning for patterns. Where's this going? And if you don't have the constellations of the past to steer by, we're even more lost than we think we are. So I think people, it's like, I don't know who said, I was writing prose and didn't know it. People do the humanities without calling it such, and would be impoverished if they did not have that tool set.
I suppose as inference, most of what we're reading on the economic pages now is, can we find some historical precedent that we can find comfort in? David?
Liz, yeah, I want to elaborate on my answer of a moment ago. And it is to the point of finding the most receptive constituencies to address. The reason, for example, in my case, that I can't sort of pull an example of sort of life-changing epiphany out of from exposure to the humanities out of thin air is, and I will just describe myself in this respect, largely because, in my case at least, I find the workload of what I do sufficiently great that when the term of court starts, I undergo a sort of annual intellectual lobotomy. And it lasts until the following summer when I sort of cram what I can into the summertime. But there, in the course of discussion here this afternoon, there have been two constituencies represented, which are very fertile constituencies. One is the constituency and a class constituency. Poor kids don't get as much as rich kids. And secondly, an immigrant constituency. Is there, in fact, an influx of people into the United States who may very well and to a great extent intersect with that first constituency, whose children are not getting the exposure to the humanities that probably everybody in this room had as a child? One approach to this might be to consider in all of those states, which I assume at this point means all the states, in which efforts are being made to not to go to English only, but at least to go to English as a second language. That instead of dealing merely in English, we deal in English and literature. I went to high school with a kid who had arrived in the United States as a DP after World War II. And in his reminiscence a few years ago, he was telling me about some of the people in a town in New Hampshire who most influenced him. And curiously enough, the first example he gave was the example of the parents of one of his and later my schoolmates, who gave him a couple of very good novels to read in English. That's a start. There are two intersecting constituencies which can be zeroed in on by people who are concerned about humanities, education, and humanities influence. And the further virtue that I think there may be in zeroing in on those constituencies is that where the humanities really makes a difference, or at least as I have seen it in my life, is not in the great moment of epiphany, but in the habit of mind that it inculcates. And if you want to form habits of mind, you form them, or at least your best bet for forming them, is when the minds are young.
Here, here. I think we could all, given a little time, make a long list of specific occasions on which somebody did the right thing because they knew this or that they had studied. But I think it's this habit of mind that one tries to inculcate. And that's what the humanities are really about. Encouraging people, insisting with people that they be capable of and that they insist on thinking otherwise.
And many of our scientists, to go back to your question, write in a historical manner. They study science based on the science that came before them. They write grant proposals. They are not devoid of thinking about either history or having to struggle to be somewhat literate in making a compelling case for their work. And it's often the scientists in the American Academy who are as compelled to fight for and talk about the value of the humanities as anyone else. I want to take one other instance for our congressman. Have any of you lately watched people being sworn in as citizens and the civics questions there posed? I wonder how many of us would be surprised at what they study and how they learn to become American. And maybe what we want to do is think about how we can all learn to become American again. Are there any other questions in the audience? Where? Okay, over there on the end. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much. Can you? Yeah. Thank you, panelists. My name's Laura Doyle, and I'm struck by there being two dimensions involved here. One being support for the humanists doing the research, and someone made the comment that although a couple of people commented that sometimes those studies and knowledge seem arcane or too specialized, but there's value in that. That brings subtlety and things. Knowledge is built on those. So there needs to be support for that. At the same time, there's the sort of activist side, the reaching out, building interdisciplinary initiatives, and also reaching congressmen and those kinds of things. And it feels like a lot. And so I have, I guess, sort of two sub-questions, one on each side of that. One is the question of whether you think, anyone thinks we can be doing something at the graduate level in our programs to develop, cultivate among our graduate students, and perhaps reward pointed jobs for our graduate students that would develop the sort of activist side of things, bridging the humanities, building programs, advocating, and yeah.
Question mark.
Okay. So what can we do at the graduate level? And then my other picks up on the comment that the humanities are better supported at the richer institutions. And I'm curious about that, and I'm wondering what there is to address there.
The short answer about graduate students is give them a chance. They're longing to do that. I found a common pattern in those that I've trained. They love it at first, and the second year is like weightlifters. All they ever do is lift weights. So I want to pick up something. I came just because somebody touched my life. As a teacher, I want to get back and do that. But the apprenticeship is so long. If we built in that as an expectation, start using the humanities as you're learning them, that would help enormously. I know the students that I know would love that opportunity.
Any other responses to that question? Okay. Back here on near the aisle, gentlemen.
C.P. Snow's Two Cultures have come up over and over again in the conversation this afternoon. And one of the things that distinguishes the humanities from the sciences is that the sciences are prized precisely to the degree that they're exclusive and mysterious. They have their measure of success is external. And we give them money because none of the rest of us can do what they do. The humanities is charged with a kind of democratizing to cultivate these habits of mind at large and to be accessible. And so we either, on the one hand, we either become arcane and specialized and risk ridicule in the public press when they go through our conference programs and look at the titles of our papers, or we succeed and cause everyone to believe that we could all do this. Do you agree with that analysis? And if so, do you see a way out of that conundrum?
I'd like to disagree in some measure with your diagnosis of how it is that the sciences seem to represent what they represent. Part of the problem in the country is, as I suggested at least tangentially, is that American kids don't want to be scientists either, or mathematicians. The lack of brain power going into those fields is a serious national matter. And what we need to understand is what is it about our culture that makes too many young people think this is not an exciting and interesting thing to do. Another part of the issue is, of course, that we are all so in the thrall of top 10 lists. I mean, this is baked into our culture in such an extraordinary way. And starting in grade school, who are the smart kids? The smart kids are the ones that are good in arithmetic, because you can tell who's good in arithmetic right away. You know, you give a quiz, and by golly, you know who got 100 and who got 98. And the things we deal with in the humanities are not so easily measured and quantified. And so this appetite to be able to say, oh, yes, you must be really smart because you're good in arithmetic, is part of our problem. And I think it's so deeply embedded in our culture that it badly affects the sciences every bit as much as it affects the humanities.
Question over here, Carol. Wait.
Carolyn Brown, Library of Congress. Two thoughts in terms of strategy. I'm wondering if we might do well to define with greater precision what we mean by habits of mind, because we have a nice liberal arts sense of that, but it might be helpful in making the argument to define what that is and what good is it, and how, as we face problems today, habits of mind are really important. And I'd like to ask, so that's one question, would it be useful, do you think, to define it more? And the second one is maybe it would be useful, and I'd like your reflections on this, to talk about habits of heart. You alluded to it when you spoke about reading to children. But I think there's a whole way in which bringing the heart and the mind together might open avenues for us. And I'm wondering if some language about habits of heart and definitions of habits of mind might be useful.
Well, I use the phrase habits of mind, so I'll step up to the plate on that. Again, it is not a term that I came here with a definition to throw out, but I can't help but begin the answer to your question with the recollection of some remarks I heard years ago by Howard Mumford Jones. And he basically took the view that most Harvard students are illiterate and committed to remaining illiterate. And he was sort of gently berating his audience about the way they spent their time. And as I recall, he sort of tried to analyze a day down in which there might be, I don't know, 18 minutes free. And Jones said, "What should you do in the 18 minutes?" And there was a pause. And he said, "You could read a book." One of the habits of mind is as basic and simple as that. To find a book such a familiar thing that if there is a moment, one will open it. A second habit of mind follows from opening enough of those books. It teaches a lesson which was emphasized over and over again by one of America's greatest judges, Learned Hand, and it was the lesson which he said, if he could have his way, he would have engraved over the door of every school, every state house, every courthouse in the United States. And they were the words of Oliver Cromwell, which he used in a disputation with some of the Scottish Presbyterians. His words, in brief, were, "Consider that ye may be wrong." One of the habits of mind which characterizes the liberal arts is that consideration. It was a consideration, I guess, which in a way animated what I said about the service that historians can do in educating us about the judges of Plessy and Ferguson. My judgment of those judges is different today from what it was before I had read a lot of legal history of that period. The habit of mind that opens the book is the habit of mind that sooner or later is going to learn Oliver Cromwell's lesson, One is a physical habit, and the other one is a habit of judgment, which is likely to follow from it.
I appreciate your comments, because I was actually sitting here thinking that the one thing that I would say the most about the habits of the mind and the danger if you begin to think that life is math is this sense of certainty that has caused so much trouble, in whether it's in science and technology or governments or others. I think a sense of certainty is one of the most dangerous things for any of us to pursue, and one of the critical things about the habits of the mind is staying open to the idea of being uncertain, of the continuous learning. But I would also say about the habits of the heart, I think moving from science to what some would call charity or work is that you learn that there is very little good done by charity, that if you really want something to change, you need to stand with those that you are trying to serve, and that is the most important habit of the heart. And teachers who are great are standing with their students, not teaching to their students, and parents who are great are standing with their children, and governments that are great are standing with their constituency. And I think that combination of remaining uncertain and developing the habits of the mind that ensure that uncertainty is constantly filled with new knowledge and new opportunity to fill in the gaps, combined with that major habit of the heart, that the way to serve is to stand with, not to do to, would change an awful lot of the things that we've been talking about as very relevant problems today.
So
and I even made bold to say at one point that a desire to know about other people and share their cultures, in the best of cases, rises to the level of love. And one of the things that's to be opposed in much of the way we go about academic disciplines is an insistence on a distinction between thinking and feeling, and between thinking and doing, as if those were somehow radically different from one another. And that's something we inherited from universities in the past that we really need to get over.
So as we have to bring this program to a close, John Adams, you set it up perfectly for me, said that the nation needed thinkers and doers, and he was not thinking about two separate categories. And he said of the American Academy, it should not be of the schoolmen of Cambridge, but the farmers, the theologians, the merchants, as well as the scholars banding together. And in a sense, that's his love letter to us. And I want to thank our panel for helping us perhaps bring a love letter to Congress. They surely could need it. Thank you all. So let me again thank our speakers, and in the tradition of the Academy, founded 229 years ago, I now dissolve the 1940th stated meeting of the Academy.